I'd like to welcome and introduce the topic, which I can't advance my slides, but it's Rick Kelsch and Leslie Johnson. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and they're going to introduce their topic and proceed with the cafe series today. So welcome.
Thank you, Paul. This is Rick Kelsch at the University of Nebraska, and Leslie Johnson is going to be joining me today. She's also here at the University of Nebraska, and we're going to be leading, I guess, this discussion, and it will probably be more of a discussion than a webinar, but hope to share a few things that might be of interest to some of you and provide you with a possible educational experience that you might be able to replicate in your own states. Let me see if I can share my screen here. I think I'll share the whole screen today. All right. Are you seeing my PowerPoint, Leslie?
Yes, it's in edit mode. There you go.
Okay, very good.
Looks good.
And I'm pleased to be together with the soil health group. My background in soil health is fairly modest, so most of you could teach me a lot in this area. But my work or my history has been more dealing with environmental issues related to the livestock industry. So I talk a lot of manure, and we've been working with in the extension side of things here in Nebraska for a number of years in this issue area, and placing more and more emphasis on helping our animal feeding operations think in terms of successfully moving manure off of their animal feeding operations onto neighboring crop farms. And we'll talk a little bit about why in just a second. And so the product we're going to share with you today is an educational experience that we've designed and pilot tested this past winter to make that a very interactive discussion with animal producers and potentially other audiences as well. This winter we had an opportunity to test this with a couple of audiences, and I think there's some opportunity to share this beyond this. So what we're going to focus on today is selecting preferred land application sites. Many of our animal feeding operations need to move nitrogen and phosphorus off. And so as we think about where we're going to move that manure, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which of these sites is going to benefit the most? And so let's start with that premise and just give you a little bit of background in terms of why this is important. If you think about the flow of nutrients in our animal agricultural systems, we are certainly producing a lot of our feed grain, or a lot of our grains is for a feed purpose. Even much of our forage is produced for feed purpose, and it's moved down the road to an animal feeding operation. I've depicted for Nebraska a beef operation. We have to recognize that that animal only recovers a part of those nutrients. For a beef animal, it's in the range of 10 to 20%, and for different species, it varies. So we've got a chunk of that nutrients that showed up on this farm in the corn that we're purchasing that needs to be moved back to that cornfield, and it's in the range of 80 to 90%. Historically, we've done that all within a single business enterprise. The crop production, the animal production was all in the same business enterprise. But over the last generation or so, that's changed pretty dramatically. Oftentimes, our corn producer and our animal producer are two different businesses. So we've got to close this loop and engage people outside of that animal feeding operation in order to be successful. Now, that corn farmer has a choice for their fertility product. They can choose whether they're going to use commercial fertilizers, import commercial fertilizer from outside that region, or they're going to recycle nitrogen and phosphorus from that animal feeding operation. And so our challenge is to help that decision weigh more often in favor of that animal feeding operation, so that we have that opportunity for conducting that recycling. But this is a voluntary decision, and we need to think in terms of what are going to be the factors that weigh into that decision for that crop farmer. What are going to be the benefits of the manure that crop farmer might be willing to consider, and what are some of the challenges that they may encounter that we're going to have to overcome. So that's why this is important, is we're trying to reestablish this recycling loop, just to ensure that the environmental sustainability of many of our animal feeding operations. Now, one of the ways that we can encourage manure's use compared to fertilizer is by thinking in terms of the organic value of the material. The carbon in that manure is an energy source. It's an energy source for all of the biology in that soil system. And it has some impacts upon that soil system in terms of both soil biological properties as well as physical properties, as well as the chemical properties, the nitrogen and phosphorus. And so one of the options that we have for encouraging the use of manure is to help people understand that value of that carbon. And there's been some analysis done in the research literature in the last couple of years that has looked at kind of the broad range of research comparisons that have been done of manure versus fertilizer, and asked overall, how does these two products compare? And this is just one of those studies, reviewing 141 different studies. And when they made these comparisons, they found that on average, corn yields in the manured studies increased by 10%. And that may be in part due to the improvements in soil health, soil quality. They found that the nitrogen losses, both in terms of water losses to water, runoff, and groundwater, as well as losses into the air, have dropped significantly, which is probably something some of us might not have thought as being the case. But when we think about it, that nitrogen is often packaged in an organic form rather than an inorganic form, and that is less mobile in the environment. And so on average, these studies are finding that significant, some drop in water quality, losses to water. And then, of course, that is partially being driven by that nitrogen being stored in a MBN, microbial biomass nitrogen. And then, of course, the part that many of you are most interested in is that soil carbon pool. And of course, you see that increasing as well, the microbial biomass carbon being fairly significant. So just one example of what the research literature is saying about manure's benefit value to improvements in soil health. So that's about all the research that we're going to get into today. And from here, our focus is going to move more into the mapping exercise and what that looks like. So Leslie, would you like to pick it up from here and share some thoughts?
Sure. If you want to just advance through all of the animations, and I will just present from there. All right. So our primary audience for the pilot of this exercise that Rick talked about this winter was livestock producers here in the state of Nebraska and manure haulers in Minnesota, because of that, our collaborators up there. One of our big goals with the development of the activity was to increase the critical thinking from our participants and really encourage them to think about more than the convenience of the field when it comes to that manure application in their own situations, not just in this activity. So we designed it so that we were looking at 4 field sites, and we discussed the barriers and benefits of each site, knowing that more than 4 fields were going to be needed to apply all of the manure from our operation, which we also talk about in a different activity. To make it a little bit more fun, we used happy emojis on the field for each benefit from manure and sad emojis for each barrier for using manure. The interactive nature of the exercise allowed for a lot of discussion and the sharing of different perspectives, as well as talking about other benefits and barriers that we didn't necessarily plan to discuss, but did come up a little bit more organically. Next slide. The map shows 4 fields and the animal feeding operation on that 5 by 5 mile area. We also have cards with description of the fields that include the crop rotations, soil characteristics, including a soil test, and potential water quality risks of that particular field. It still left a little bit that they had to actually look at the pictures and see what it was like, and then they could relate back to their own operations for other things we didn't go ahead and give them. The livestock operation card described the animal feeding operation and notes the amount of manure produced, as well as a best guess of how many acres it would take to apply that much manure to the fields on a nitrogen as well as a phosphorus basis. So we talked about the land area that is needed for that particular field animal feeding operation. And then we place our happy emoji cards for the benefits and the sad emoji cards for the barriers for each field. Next slide. So some of the other topics that we talk about, like I said, the exercise is broken down into 6 sections where we have an introduction to the animal feeding operation. That's when we talk about land base and the amount of space that you need to apply manure. And we talk about agronomic benefits, including the calculations of how much dollar value you get out of those nutrients. We talk about the cost of transportation and how far you can feasibly haul that manure, or whether or not it's feasible to haul that manure to any of our fields on the map. We talk about water quality risks, including both surface and groundwater risk. And you're going to see the soil health benefits and barriers, one that we might, when we look at the activity here in a little bit. And then we also talk about potential neighbor nuisances. The things that we don't necessarily focus on, but often come up, and again, with those organic discussions that just naturally happen in this process, are things like logistical issues, such as time and the amount of labor that you have available to your animal feeding operation when you're applying manure, as well as potential yield gains from having a field that has not received manure before, as well as the water quality benefits, not just the risks. Like decreased erosion from the amount of manure that you apply and increasing that organic matter. So Rick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, and I was trying to get the chat box open here so I can send that link.
Oh, sure. I can do that too.
Do you have the links handy?
Yep, I sure do.
Okay, I'm not finding the chat box. Okay.
That's fine.
All right. Let's see, this jumped way ahead, didn't it? No, I
don't think so.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So there, as Leslie visited, there are 6 different activities, and associated with those activities, we have background information about the animal feeding operation, the crops, the fields, and then we have worksheets that are completed for each activity. And we're going to work on share activity 5 with you today, which is focuses on the topic of soil quality and which of those 4 fields might benefit the most from use of animal manures. So you're going to be going through a discussion within your group. We are going to share with you 3 soil health measures that we have been using during this first year, and using those to evaluate the fields and determine whether there's a benefit or not from manure. We also want you to have some discussion amongst yourself in terms of just observations that you might make about within a field, because most farmers are at this point in time not going to have access to those soil health measures. So what are some things you would just look at in a field? that might say this field is going to benefit more from manure or not as much. So I think there's some common observations, and we hear a lot of that as we have this discussion with farmers. To go through this activity today, you're going to need access to a series of 4 files. And Leslie has just placed in the chat box, I believe, a link to 4 Google Drive files. It'll get you into a folder, and all 4 of them should be there, and it should look a little like this. Leslie, is that accessible to everybody? You're on mute.
Yes, they should have it. It should be in that chat box.
Okay, so encourage you to open that up in a browser window. And then I would suggest going ahead and clicking on each of these. 3 of these are Google Drive files, like maps, field cards, soil quality worksheets. And then the 4th one is a Word document. We won't use that much today. I'll make mention that what that is kind of a packet of information for the farmer to take home and reuse this exercise when they return home. So it has, I think, 3 different one-page type fact sheets that will kind of give them the background that they got introduced to during the activity. We're going to do a little bit of modification of this to actually put the worksheets as part of the packet as well. But so we're not quite finalized the products, but we're getting really close here. So at least open these 3 as different browser windows, have those handy. Just give you a little introduction to those. Okay, and here was the link for those, but I think that's already in the chat box. Okay. So if you open the map, you'll see something such as this. Now, when Leslie and I did this through the winter, we did this as around a table. This was a map that we had printed out and laid on a table, and we would set generally 8 people around that table with this large tabletop map. And we would often divide people up into teams of 2. So 2 individuals would be responsible for field 1, 2 for field 2, and so forth. And then as you completed the calculations or the discussion for your field, then you would share your results with the whole group. And that team of 2 would also place their emojis for field 1 and so forth. We're going to try to do this electronically using Google Drive, using Google Sheets today. I think this will work. It's always an adventure, but we'll make sure. We hope that'll give you a reasonable approximation of what how this looks. So you'll have this map laying out in front of you on a tabletop. You'll discuss, kind of what you're seeing on the map. I think we'll just go over this, and then you can grab these emojis and move them onto the map during your discussion today. You'll also look at your field card. That's one of the files you'll have. It will have just some brief summaries of, just information about the field, about the soils, a soil test for that field, just a very brief summary of information from the soil test. One of the things we found with this exercise is we tend to overwhelm people with too much information. So we've tried to condense this down just as much as possible. So you'll use this to look up characteristics for soils that might be relevant to your discussion today. There is a worksheet that you will have access to, and there will be a bunch of X's on that worksheet, and you'll actually be sliding those X's over to field 1, 2, 3, and 4, and deciding if your particular characteristic, in this case, aggregate stability, is it kind of on the low quality side of things or the high quality side of things. And then once you've gone through, placed your X's, you'll begin moving your emojis over to the field and deciding that for your field, this looks like a good choice or not such a good choice. So that's kind of how the activity will work. Leslie, I think maybe this is, I'll let you kind of give the final instructions for breaking into the small groups.
Sure. So as Paul indicated earlier, we are going to do a little bit different. We're going to break out into breakout rooms now, and then we'll come back together here in about 15 minutes. Each room is going to take one field, and so one room is going to be field 1, one will be field 2, one will be field 3, and so on. And we want you to just to consider your own field, and then when we all come back together, then we'll talk about all of the different fields together and try and make a decision as far as how many or which fields is the best to apply on based on just on soil health in this case. So we're all going to be working on the same document, so don't be surprised if you're seeing everybody or the other fields getting completed. You just need to focus on yours. You'll see the decisions that are made, but you don't necessarily know what kind of conversation went into making those decisions. So don't feel like you have to do anything with those other fields. Rick mentioned moving the X along the axis in each field for that worksheet, and you should have a moderator that's available in there that will be sharing their screen and able to move things around for you. Otherwise, you are all welcome to join in there and move things around as well. Then once you make your decision on that spread or on that worksheet, then go back over to the map, and for every one of the benefits that you would have, then put a happy emoji, and every barrier then or less benefit, then you would put a sad emoji. And remember that fields that have lower soil quality right now have the most potential for improvement, and so those are the ones that we're going to be looking for to have that manure benefit, and so that's the ones that we're going to be putting that happy emoji on. Like I said, we're going to come back here in about 15 minutes, and then we'll have that discussion. And Rick already sort of introduced you to the topics that we'll talk about, but I do want you to consider those, the things that we don't necessarily say on there, those things that are going to come up organically in the decision, like the decreased erosion or the better infiltration, those things that you're not going to see necessarily in a lab test, or maybe you've never had tested before. So, and then the last question that we really want you to discuss is what other soil health measures might we do with future iterations of this activity so that we can get a little bit of feedback when we come back together.